Evan, and this is my crash course on nationalism and imperialism in Australia from 1750 to the 1900s and beyond. The start of Australian colonization. In 1770, Captain James Cook claimed Australia for Britain, leading to many following waves of British colonization. The arrival of British settlers resulted in conflicts with Indigenous Australian peoples and the displacement of many Aboriginal communities. Gale explains that prior to colonization, the original inhabitants of Australia resided on the continent for millennia. These Indigenous Australian peoples can be categorized into two groups: the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait peoples. Imperial attitudes of racial superiority justified discriminatory policies such as forced assimilation and the removal of Indigenous children. Despite the formal end of British imperialism, its legacy persists in the ongoing struggles for Indigenous rights and the cultural recognition in modern Australia. British colonization of Aboriginal populations from 1750 to the present aimed to expand territory and resources, seizing Indigenous lands through violences and legal processes like terra nullius. In Australian settlements, colonizers adopted the practice of terra nullius, nobody's land, thus not recognizing native claims to land and securing European land titles. Stolen generation, a term coined by Australian historian Peter Reid in 1981, refers to those Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were taken from their Indigenous families and communities as children. The colonization of Indigenous populations by Europeans had devastating effects on the culture of these societies. Prior to colonization, the Aboriginal peoples had rich and diverse cultures. However, the arrival of Europeans caused significant disruption. Indigenous peoples were subjected to forced assimilation, displacement from their traditional lands, and violent suppression of their cultural practices and languages. European colonization imposed Western values, religions, and worldviews onto Indigenous populations, leading to the erosion and loss of traditional cultural practices and belief systems. Indigenous peoples suffered significantly when European settlers colonized Australia and continue to feel the effects of having histories, traditions, beliefs, and cultural practices that are in conflict with what has become the dominant society. Convict settlement. Australia was used as a penal colony by the British Empire, with thousands of convicts transported there from the late 18th to mid-19th century. This period saw the establishments of cities like Sydney and Melbourne, laying the foundations for European colonization. Australian and American imperialism during expansion share similarities in their impact on native populations, including displacement, violence, cultural assimilation policies. However, they differ in colonial structures, treatment of Indigenous peoples, and legal frameworks. Australian imperialism primarily involved British rule with appointed governors, while American expansion occurred within the framework of the U.S. government. Treatment of Indigenous peoples varied, with Australia implementing policies like the Stolen Generations, while the U.S. often confined Indigenous peoples to reservations or engaged in military campaigns. Additionally, legal frameworks differed, with the U.S. making treaties with Indigenous tribes and Australia using the concept of terra nullius to claim land. These differences underscore the diverse contexts and methods of imperialism in each country. In 1850, gold was discovered in various parts of Australia, leading to a significant influx of migrants seeking fortune. This gold rush has contributed to the growth of cities and the development of infrastructure. Australia became a federation in 1901, with the 6 colonies uniting to form the Commonwealth of Australia. This was the beginning of Australia's journey to an independent, modern nation. Australia, however, continued to remain within the shadow of the British Empire despite ambitions as a nation. Australia's national identity evolved significantly due to colonialism, Indigenous British tensions, and the struggle for independence. Australia's identity was deeply influenced by British colonization. However, as the 19th century progressed, Australian nationalism emerged fueled by factors like distance from Britain, shared experiences, movements for independence such as Gold Rush's Federation furthered this nationalism. Yet tensions over Indigenous rights and immigration policies persisted. The profound British influence on Australia's governance is evident in its adoption of the Westminster system, English common law, and administrative structures mirroring British institutions. This legacy, rooted in Australia's colonial past, has shaped political, legal, and administrative systems. Despite adaptations to suit local needs, British influence remains deeply ingrained, reflecting a historical connection that continues to shape governance in Australia. The British and U.S. systems of government have had substantial influence on Australian systems of government. In fact, the Australian Parliament has been referred to as Washminster model, a combination of U.S. Washington model and the British Westminster model. Australia experienced a large influx of immigrants, particularly from Europe and Asia. This immigration wave contributed to a multicultural character of modern-day society. Throughout the 20th century, Indigenous Australians fought for recognition, land rights, and social justice. This 1967 referendum, which granted Indigenous Australian citizenship and allowed the federal government to legislate on their behalf, was a significant milestone in this struggle.